Hi everyone, my name is Amit Kinha. I'm the field CTO at DoiT. And previously, before this role, I was leading FinOps globally at Citibank for public cloud. Today, I want to talk about, I don't have slides prepared. I think it's much easier to actually, just talk. I want to talk about FinOps 3.0, this concept that we've been percolating on. And the idea really is that if you take a step back and you think about originally why FinOps started, what I call 1.0, the idea was we wanted to be able to have visibility first and foremost, right? We have a lot of different accounts. We have some maybe multi-cloud, and tagging was really important. Things like allocations, and the idea really was, I want to see my bill that I get at the end of the month, but I want to be able to understand it, right? And look at it not only once a month, but maybe once a day, and be able to aggregate data across everything. Now that was really important, and so I'm assuming like early 2010s when we first got started in cloud. But then we quickly run into this area of, okay, we have our data, but now what can we do with it, right? And to me, that's FinOps 2.0, which is all about accountability, right? So we started being able to create dashboards with personas for engineering leaders, which is different than, say, the CFO. We're getting some level of optimization reports, right? EC2 instances that are oversized, and a level of cost ownership. So things like anomaly detection, when something goes wrong, really holding teams within enterprises accountable. I actually don't have any slides. I was just going to talk for 20 minutes, Victor. So to me, the, 2.0 was really interesting because a lot of the things that were coming out, it's almost like endless good ideas, right? If you think about optimization, every time you scroll through the myriad of different tools we have, and there's like 17 pages of recommendations. And oftentimes it felt almost non-contextualized, right? For example, if you wanted to move, from X to Y, and it said, hey, you can save this much money. But what we didn't account for was the fact that, well, to do that change in a large enterprise, it might take you 9 months of effort. And so all of a sudden, a lot of these optimization recommendations, dashboards, it felt very static, right? It didn't feel like we didn't really understand what the business needed, the context of it. And oftentimes when we looked at cost data, we talk about unit economics a lot, but at the end of the day, what we're really describing is, can we have the ability to understand when, say, the cost goes up by $1 million over the weekend, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Should I be worried or not? So if you get an anomaly that said, hey, you spent a lot more money, of course you should freak out about it. But then if you realize, say you're in the front of TechCrunch and your daily active user count went up 5x, all of a sudden it doesn't seem so bad in relative, right? So for me, 3.0, especially now with AI, is really all about being able to have contextual understanding of cost, and it becomes a decision driver in the way that when we talk about shift left, you're able to now use this contextualized cost data to make better decisions. And to me, there are three key pillars of 3.0, right? The first one is data. Now, data is, the fundamental building blocks of FinOps, right? We have our cost data, we have some utilization data we marry together, and then we have our business data, right? And the business data would be things like your revenue or anything that you want to use unit economics for. But for me now, especially with AI, it's much more important to now be able to contextualize the data side of things. So you're no longer looking at, for example, what's happened in the past, right? Instead, you're using this data to leverage how can I predict the future in a way that isn't just an AWS calculator that is always, an L0 estimate that is completely wrong every single time there. Example of that could be like, say, you're doing a model training for inference, and it looks very expensive in isolation. And you think, well, I can't spend, 100 hours on a P5 instance on AWS. That's going to be very expensive. But how do you tie that now to the whole journey of that model now running in production afterward? And then looking at the ROI, right? What are we actually getting back in return there? So to be able to understand this entire concept, I think it's really important because what I've noticed in large enterprises is that the FinOps practitioner level is really focused on the cost for cloud. But at a certain level above them, maybe directly to their manager, or say the head of IT, or maybe even the CTO itself, cost data from FinOps is important, but without the contextualization of, well, what are we getting back in return? And what is the total cost of everything, not just this specific isolated cost? It is a thing that everyone needs, right? So executives want to be able to see things like margin, right? They want to be able to understand if you're a B2B company, What is per customer cost? Especially now with AI, if you expose, say, a chatbot in your app to your end user, and you have some power users, let's put it that way, who love pinging it nonstop, the cost on your side is going to be much higher than it was previously. It becomes very non-deterministic, right? So being able to contextualize your cost data along with the utilization data, along with the business data that not just even for unit economics, but other business use cases like margin protection, cost per customer, it's going to become very paramount there. For me, the second thing then after data then is efficiency, right? So like I said, in 2.0, we have endless good ideas, right? We scroll through, we see EC2 right sizing, we see things like, hey, use transit gateway instead of VPC peering, on and on and on. But we really, in 3.0, for me, it becomes very critical to be able to do an analysis of like, well, what is the actual most important thing today, right? It might be that, hey, you are still in experimentation phase with AI, and like most of us are, and there's really no need to worry about over optimizing at the rate, right? For example, a provision throughput that gives you a discount. Because the truth is, the models are changing very quickly, right? Every time OpenAI has a seminar, it feels like they've just killed five companies and created five new companies out of there. And something that might be the frontier model today that you're using might be obsolete in 6 months, right? So for me, efficiency in 3.0, especially with AI, is really about prioritizing based on impact, effort, and fit, right? A 1% saving that may take 9 months to implement might not be worth it where you can get 0.25% savings today, right? So being able to understand in context of what will it take to actually get this done in your actual enterprise is something that we overlook often. And the truth is, without being able to do that, you go to an engineer's and the trope of engineers don't care about cost data. Being a former engineer, I've always found that to be really funny. I think it's not that I don't care. I've never had the right tooling. And, if I'm an engineer and someone comes to me and says, you got to implement these five things because your report card for FinOps says you're a D minus. And if I take a look at those five things, I'm like, well, it doesn't apply to our company. We don't use ARM processors for the quant libraries, or we can't do transit gateway because of the network architecture or something. You lose trust with the FinOps team, right? So being able to really understand where are the things that are actually relevant to me and what are the things I want to prioritize is going to become very critical there. To me, and the automation side of things is, you know, it's a spectrum, right? On one hand, you can have just insights, you can have ideas and optimization techniques. But to me, the bridge towards automation is there's a lot of things that we do as FinOps practitioners that are very manual, right? You get an anomaly alert and you have to go find the contextual data for it, raise a Jira ticket, and some team might look at it, might not. And to me, I'd rather be in a place where if there's a lot of these things that are happening again and again and again, we want to be able to automate those things, right? We want to be able to automate a lot of the processes with AI, with agentic workflows that are pretty cumbersome and take up a lot of time and are very repeatable. And instead, I want to be able to focus time on automating things that are, for example, in a way like Kubernetes, instead of having every team manually change the vCPU along with the memory limits because their app now needs only 3 gigs because of some optimization instead of 6 gigs. Those are the kind of knobs that I think a lot of engineers where we shifted too far left, right? An engineer really at the end of the day is really focused on building value for the business and not necessarily on always continuously thinking about optimization, right? To me, that's where automation can be a huge help. Wherever you have knobs, for lack of a better way of saying, configurations that are dynamically changing a lot, why don't we look at tools that can actually automate those things? So to give time back to engineers. And around efficiency, to me, the last thing is instead of having a one-off thing where, I think we've all been there if you're a practitioner where, someone calls and says, hey, what did you guys do? You spent way more money in the last month than we had intended. And when we said, hey, you have a blank check to build, we didn't literally mean a blank check, right? How do we manage that? To me, it becomes a thing where you have a cohesive roadmap to say, right now in our company, for this new product we're launching, we're not worried about optimization just yet. We know that we want to be able to look at some non-production data. We want to run in production first before we do any sort of right sizing or workload choices or commitment-based discounts like savings plans. So having a roadmap versus kind of just ad hoc happening whenever, someone freaks out about the cost is something that not only has to happen, it'll give a lot more confidence in the FinOps practice that, there's a level of trust you need with your business stakeholders that It can't be every time I ask Amit to find some savings, he finds me $1 million because EBS volumes were unattached or something. It should feel a lot more deterministic and a lot more towards a cohesive plan there. And the last step for me is, if I think about FinOps, there's data, right? In 3.0, you want to be able to contextualize it. On efficiency, you want things that will actually move the needle today and then be able to prioritize something later down the line. The last place then is governance, right? And if you've heard me talk before, I call it the FinOps moment, where all of a sudden the intern is, you open up a chatbot to everyone in the company and you think it's great. You can ask a lot of questions to it. You can tell me how many vacation days I have left. And all of a sudden you get a bill at the end of the month that is 10x more. And all of a sudden you're running around. You're like, wait, who's spending this money, right? Especially with AI now, what we're talking about is not even looking at per workload, but per person, right? And so if you have an intern who spends up and uploads a petabyte of data because he thinks AI is really cool and he did it at his personal laptop, company has available ChatGPT, but it's being paid by, per token, you want to be able to prevent these things. And so for me, governance is very similar to where I think about security was, right? You want to be able to prevent things from happening that you don't want in your company, right? Guardrails effectively. And you want to be able to build them in a way that are, finding the balance between too restrictive, where you're essentially disabling people from doing innovation, especially in the AI space, but being able to do limits, for example, maybe per person on tokens, right? Or maybe for a non-prod workload, it can only run on spot instances, or on and on and on, and do it in a way that is almost repeatable per environment, and do it in a way that isn't necessarily a lot of overhead, right? Obviously, we could use something like OPA policies and manually create it in your pipeline, but is that really sustainable? Like, can you actually now track what this guardrail prevented, right? Being able to see that, hey, because of this guardrail that we built that enforces spot instances in non-prod, this and every time someone had actually tried to do, an on-demand instance, you should be able to capture that value and then be able to justify, look, these are the reasons we're actually avoiding cost, right? It'll justify the finance practice itself. And the second part then is if you want to prevent bad things from happening, or the guardrails, things will slip, right? There's every reinvent we go to, there's another 500 new things you can do in AWS console. And so to stay ahead of it, things will go through, the guardrails. So next step then is how do you detect these things? And detection is really interesting because on one hand, you have anomaly tools, right? You can look at the curve file and then say when the cost goes up by a certain degree, notify that team something happened. But to me, I think we kind of miss the forest for the trees here because the cost is just a symptom, right? In fact, if you think about it, instead of waiting 4 hours for the curve file to be created and then you get an alert for it and then someone actions it, wouldn't you want to know immediately, right? So to be able to not only do anomaly detection of not just on cost level, but looking at the guardrails, being able to use an AI agent to now get the contextual analysis of like, well, why did this happen? Was there a release that happened yesterday? Was it we had a lot more users and be able to contextualize it? So now when you go to an engineer and you raise a ticket, you want to give them as much data as possible to understand. We think after everything we've looked at, this is an anomaly. You should look at it. And maybe instead of making an anomaly on something like just cost, what if you did anomalies on unit cost, right? Hey, since the last release yesterday, the unit cost for a million API calls went from $1 to $2.50. Was this intended, right? And this way, you're actually now looking at the business level impact of the anomaly versus just like to me, it's something similar to like when you have a fever. Sure, you could look at it and say, I have a 103-degree fever, but if there's something seriously wrong, you'd want to know what is the underlying issue there, right? And so you have detection, you have prevention, and then finally remediation. And I think AI is really, really going to be critical here. So remediation to me is not just you get the anomaly or you detect something's off, right? The bill is too high, for lack of a better way of saying it. What do you do about it? And traditionally, it would mean that someone has to go digging, looking at what caused this to happen. Then they have to figure out, was this okay, right? For example, the TechCrunch example I gave, yeah, cost went up, but it's okay. It didn't go up that much compared to what the value we're getting back. But if it is something that you didn't intend to happen, normally the fix would be that you have to find the code where it happened. You have to go to the engineering team, convince them, hey, this is a big problem. Probably get a buy-in from a product person and say, yeah, we got to fix it now. And support it in a way, the same way people would take if the app was down or there's a critical bug in the system. Now, with AI, I'd love to be in a place where I think the remediation itself, if you're using, say, Terraform or another, IAC pipeline, we should be able to plug into that pipeline, grab the source code, understand what is the change that needs to happen, recommend that change, right? And maybe open up the PR, MR for the person to look at with the detailed analysis of this is why we think we should fix this, right? Update the guardrail so it doesn't happen again if you want to prevent it automatically. And then it's still up to the engineer or the product person to approve it. So this way, what we're really doing is shortening that time of detection, right? To and remediation on a level where, again, it's not automation, this big scary thing a lot of enterprises freak out about. It's more of why are we wasting our own time doing things that AI can help us do, right? Being able to have an agentic workload that says when a context of an anomaly comes in, get the CloudWatch logs, for example, look at the PRs that were recently merged in, understand what might be causing this change, and then bundle it all up. And that is the alert that we send out going forward instead of, hey, the cost went up $100, good luck. Um, and I think by doing this, all the things I'm describing here, what it really does is build trust with the FinOps team, right? Instead of looking at the FinOps team as this ivory tower that pushes down to engineers that says, you guys are bad, do something about it. And from a CFO perspective, looking at the FinOps team saying, yeah, I get value from them, but I feel like I don't have confidence that every dollar I'm giving to AWS, what I'm getting back in return. You flip it, and now you become this team that is almost critical functionality that is helping our users instead of just being a nuisance, right? And finally, if you think about AI, right, I know I've described a lot of different ways AI can help, but I'm sure there's a lot of talks yesterday as well, and there'll be more today about AI. But the FinOps for AI side is very interesting. AI for FinOps is, tokenomics and everything else we can talk about. But for me, FinOps or AI for FinOps is the most interesting because there's a lot of things that if you think about different stages that we can use it for. Instead of having, say a CEO who asks a question of what is my bill or what is the forecast for our PPA? Are we going to hit it or not? And then, goes to game of telephone towards finally an engineer who kind of collates it all together, extracts the data, puts in Excel, and then puts into a PowerPoint for the executive to consume from. What if they could just ask the question directly in the console that you have? What is the forecast for my PPA? Will I hit it or not? And if not, what are my options? Right? To me, that is something that we should be able to do very easily. And so cut down that, time between asking a question, translating it, and then getting a reply and then translating it back. Well, to me, AI is a great use case for that. Right. And the other side is then when you think about a lot of the stuff I'm describing, the guardrails, the unit economics, all these things, I think a lot of times what we have is we have a lot of tools out there in the industry. And what ends up happening is you have this moment where, I did, when you connect all the data into your tool, the silver bullet that's supposed to solve all your problems, you kind of just look at it. Now, what do we do? Right? The engineers still need to log in every time to actually get the data. You still have to build a bunch of dashboards. You still have to get a lot of reports. You still have to build these guardrails manually, understand the syntax and everything. For me, AI is a great way to abstract that up into English. Why can't I just say in English, hey, I want to prevent things in nonprofit from using Spot, and in the background, the guardrails are built, and I approve it, right? And so for me, this abstraction layer is going to be very critical towards really moving fast in FinOps, and instead of being stuck on looking at dashboards and hoping that, hey, this number went up, now let me do something about it. I want to be able to use AI to enrich our data, right? Like I talked about, detect anomalies with the full context of why it's happening, be able to forecast, right? With context of understanding. It's not just the forecast today is not just going to be based on what you did previously. Tell me what's going to change, right? Hey, we're non-prod and we're expecting 1 million users to join as soon as we go to production. Great. Imagine just saying that, and then we can figure out in the background, well, based on unit economics, based on the savings plan you have, in production, we think you're going to be spending this much within a margin of error. Or being able to ask something like, I see my GPU spend is going up and up. Why is that happening? And behind the scenes, what we're looking at is understanding, well, yeah, the GPU cost did go up. This workload that was tagged for, this inference training we're doing, post-training, this is a reason. And here's a detailed breakdown of, who's causing it, where the PR was that was approved for it, and here's a Jira ticket that the business sponsor had approved it there. And finally, yeah, look, for me, what AI think lastly can help with in this 3.0 era will be the goal of FinOps, I think, it almost feels like an echo chamber sometimes that when you talk to FinOps practitioners, right? all these things we want to do, but eventually you talk to someone who's like, isn't your team's job just to save money? And you're trying to explain to them, no, we do all these other things, whatever. And I think finally in 3.0, we'll be in the place where the goal is not to cut costs. The goal is to make smarter investments, right? The goal is to now, for dollar that we're investing in AWS or Google or Snowflake or MongoDB, Atlas or whatever, we can quantify the ROI and we can justify it and enable us to spend more money, right? And I think as soon as like we figure out that like AI runs on data, but it really scales on cost intelligence, to me, that's FinOps 3.0. With that, I think I'm right at time actually. So Victor, thanks again for
Yeah,
having me.
you
Really
make it
glad to
right
learn
on
about it.
time.
Yeah.
So give it some love in the reaction to Amit. I think it was a very wonderful presentation. So definitely love it.